Welcome back to Stories of Slavery. Today, we're heading back to 1869, to the story of Jabari. He was a giant African hunter, a young man whose presence alone stunned the American South. His skills ignited fear, started rumors, and created a mystery that left everyone baffled. It's a hard story, an intense one. So take a breath, listen closely, and let it sink in. Before we start, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know which city and country you're listening from. Your support means these stories get told, not buried. Let's begin. It was the summer of 1869. On a cotton plantation about 40 miles west of New Orleans, a group of wealthy white men came together for something they called a sporting event. They showed up with rifles, whiskey, and dogs trained specifically for tracking escaped slaves. They had been invited to see a spectacle. Their host, Colonel Marcus Whitmore, promised it would be unlike anything they'd witnessed before. The prey, Whitmore announced with all the flair of a showman, would be an African giant. A savage straight from the deepest jungles of the Congo. More animal than man, he said. A creature made for excellent sport, to be hunted and brought down just like any other beast. But what happened over the next 48 hours turned into Louisiana legend. Just not the kind Whitmore had in mind. By sunrise on the third day, 3 hunters were dead. 7 more were injured, badly enough that they'd never fully heal. And Colonel Whitmore himself. They found him tied to a cypress tree in his own swamp, crying, begging for mercy, surrounded by every enslaved person he had abused for years. The African giant? Gone. Vanished into the wilderness, along with 43 men, women, and children, people who should have been free 4 years earlier but were held captive through fraud, violence, and a nation's willful blindness to justice. This is the real story of Jabari. The hunter who became the hunted, and then became the hunter once again. It's a story about survival, revenge, courage, and cunning. About a man everyone underestimated. And how he made them pay in ways they couldn't imagine. But the story doesn't start in Louisiana. It starts 6,000 miles away, on the banks of the Congo River, in the autumn of 1868. The village was called Mbanza. It had stood there for over 300 years. Its people were part of the Congo Kingdom, one of the most advanced civilizations in Central Africa, complete with a written language, organized government, and trade networks reaching across the continent. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, scholars, warriors, and priests. They had survived Portuguese colonization, centuries of the slave trade, and the constant pressure of rival kingdoms. Jabari was born in Mbanza in 1852. The third son of a man named Kenj, the village war chief. That made Jabari royalty, of a sort, though he wasn't in line for leadership. His older brothers would inherit their father's duties. Jabari's path was different. From the age of 7, he was trained as a hunter. This wasn't casual education. For the Congo people, hunters held a special place in society. They brought meat to the community, protected the village from predators, traveled far into the wilderness, and learned its secrets. A skilled hunter could do more than a dozen warriors, working alone, surviving where others would perish, relying on patience and intelligence rather than brute strength. Jabari was exceptional at it. By age 12, he'd killed his first leopard, tracking it for 3 days through thick jungle before cornering it in a ravine and taking it down with a single spear thrust. At 14, he faced down a forest elephant terrorizing outlying farms. Using fire, noise, and careful positioning, he drove the massive animal away from human settlements. By 16, he was known as one of the finest hunters in the region. Neighboring villages sought his help with dangerous animals. Even his father consulted him on matters of defense and strategy. Physically, Jabari was extraordinary, by any standard. He stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, a height that would turn heads anywhere, but in the mid-19th century, when most men averaged about 5 foot 6, it was almost unheard of. Years of running through forests, climbing trees, hauling heavy loads across rough terrain had built a body layered with muscle. His shoulders were so wide, he had to turn sideways to get through most doors. His hands could encircle a grown man's skull. But what truly set Jabari apart wasn't his size. It was his mind. He inherited his father's gift for strategy. The ability to see a situation from every angle. To anticipate an opponent's next move. To plan 3 or 4 steps ahead while seeming to act on pure instinct. That gift served him well as a hunter, where the line between success and death often came down to predicting an animal's reaction to pressure. And it would serve him even better in Louisiana, where the animals he hunted walked on two legs and thought they were masters of creation. The capture came in October 1868. By then, the Atlantic slave trade had been illegal for decades. The United States banned importing enslaved people in 1808. Britain had spent fortunes patrolling the African coast to intercept slave ships. International pressure had pushed most European nations to abandon the practice. But laws on paper don't always match reality on the ground. In the chaos after the American Civil War, while the federal government focused on reconstruction and integrating 4 million freed people into society, some opportunists saw a chance to make money. The Deep South still demanded labor. The supply of workers willing to accept plantation conditions was low. And there were always men willing to break laws for profit. A group of investors based in New Orleans set up a smuggling operation. They brought captured Africans through Cuba, where Spanish officials could be bribed, and then slipped them into the Louisiana bayous, evading federal patrols. It wasn't a huge operation, maybe a few hundred people a year, but profitable enough to draw serious money and serious protection. The team that reached Jabari's region had 12 men, Portuguese traders, Arab middlemen, and African collaborators from rival tribes. They'd been working the area for months, snatching people from isolated farms and small villages, avoiding larger settlements that could fight back. Mbanza was too big to attack directly. But the capture team was patient. They watched. They waited. They found weaknesses. One of them was Jabari's younger sister, Amara. Amara was 15, beautiful, and like a lot of teenage girls, she sometimes wandered farther from the village than was safe. She had a favorite spot by a waterfall 2 miles from Mbanza. A place to be alone, to think, to escape the pressure of being the war chief's daughter. They took her on a Tuesday afternoon. When Jabari found out, he did what any brother would. He tracked them through the forest, reading signs others would miss, moving faster than men burdened with captives. He caught up at their camp, 12 miles out, just as the sun was setting. He could have attacked. Armed with his hunting spear and a knife, he was confident he could kill several before they overwhelmed him. But Amara was tied to a tree in the middle of camp. A knife pressed to her throat by a man who looked ready to use it. The leader, a Portuguese trader named Ferreiro, made Jabari an offer. Surrender, and Amara goes free. Fight, and she dies before you reach her. Jabari looked at his sister. He looked at the knife. He looked at the 12 men around him, weapons ready, eyes hungry for the profit his capture would bring. He dropped his spear. Ferreiro kept his word. After a fashion. Amara was released, given a few hours head start before anyone could follow. She made it back to Mbanza and told their father. Search parties went out. But by then, Jabari was already on a ship. Chained in a hold with 40 others, sailing west toward a fate he couldn't imagine. The crossing took 11 weeks. Jabari never spoke of it in detail, not then, not ever. But the historical record tells us what those journeys were like. Hundreds of people packed into spaces meant for cargo. Disease spreading like wildfire. Death rates hitting 30 or 40% before landfall. Constant darkness, suffocating heat, sounds and smells of human suffering compressed into a space too small to comprehend. What we know about Jabari's time on that ship comes in fragments, things he mentioned years later to people he trusted. We know he was kept apart from the others for most of the voyage, chained alone in a compartment near the captain's quarters. That was because of his size, which made the crew nervous. And because Ferreiro had marked him as valuable cargo, needing to arrive in good condition. He was fed better, given water more often, allowed on deck occasionally for air and exercise. We also know he used every moment of that relative freedom to observe. He watched the ship's operation. Learned the crew's rhythms, when they changed watches, when they slept, when they were alert, when they were careless. He studied the ocean, the stars, the patterns of wind and current the sailors used to navigate. He listened to conversations in Portuguese and Spanish and English, languages he didn't speak, but began to understand through context and repetition. He was preparing. For what, he didn't yet know. But he was preparing. The ship reached Cuba in January 1869. The captives were moved to a holding facility outside Havana. Cleaned, fed, readied for sale. Jabari spent 3 weeks there, watched constantly by guards warned about his size, his potential danger. The buyer who purchased him was an American named Theodore Marsh, a broker who supplied labor to Louisiana plantations. Marsh paid $400 for Jabari, double the going rate for a healthy adult male. Because Colonel Marcus Whitmore had specifically asked for an African of unusual size and strength. Whitmore had plans for such a man. Plans he described in detail at a meeting in New Orleans 2 months earlier. The colonel wanted a spectacle. Marcus Whitmore was 53 in 1869. Born into one of Louisiana's wealthiest families. Heir to a cotton empire built over 3 generations by enslaved people. He'd gone to West Point, served in the Mexican-American War, risen to colonel in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He never accepted the South's defeat. Never accepted emancipation. Certainly never accepted that the people who worked his family's land for a century were legally free to leave. Whitmore's plantation, Belmont, sprawled across 12,000 acres along Bayou Lafourche. Before the war, over 300 enslaved people worked it. After the war, federal law required Whitmore to free them and either pay them as laborers or let them go. Whitmore did neither. Instead, he built a system that kept slavery alive in all but name. Workers were told they owed debts for housing, food, clothing, tools, debts calculated so they could never be paid off. Anyone trying to leave was warned they'd be arrested for theft if they didn't settle their accounts first. Those who pushed back got visits from masked men at night. Beatings. Burned homes. Sometimes they just disappeared. The local sheriff was Whitmore's cousin. The local judge had served under Whitmore in the war. Federal officials responsible for enforcing Reconstruction were bribed, threatened, or simply ignored complaints, because who had the resources to investigate every report of abuse in a state drowning in it? By 1869, Whitmore had effectively rebuilt the antebellum plantation system. 217 people lived and worked on his land under conditions indistinguishable from slavery. But Whitmore wasn't satisfied with mere control. He wanted to make a statement. The war had humiliated him. The occupation humiliated him. Seeing black men in Union uniforms, former slaves voting and holding office, a world turned upside down, it all burned in his gut. He needed to prove, to himself and his peers, that the natural order still stood. That white men were still the masters. That black people were still animals to be used and discarded. An African giant would serve that purpose perfectly. Whitmore imagined a creature from the jungle. Savage, uncivilized. Proof that black people were fundamentally different. Fundamentally inferior. Suited only for labor and servitude. He would show this creature to his friends. Demonstrate his power over it. And eventually, when the novelty faded, he would hunt it. The hunt was the climax of his fantasy. A return to the old days, when planters chased escaped slaves through swamps with dogs and guns. When the chase was sport and capture was entertainment. Whitmore had joined such hunts before the war. He missed them. He wanted that thrill again, and he wanted to share it with others who felt the same. Jabari reached Belmont in February 1869. They transported him from New Orleans in a wagon cage, the kind meant for dangerous animals. Wrists and ankles chained. An iron collar around his neck, fastened to the cage bars. The trip took 2 days. Jabari spent it watching the landscape. Memorizing landmarks. Noting the sun's direction, the flow of water in the streams they crossed. When the wagon pulled up to Belmont, a crowd had gathered. Whitmore had announced the arrival of his African giant, and every white person on the property, plus many from neighboring plantations, came to see. They pulled Jabari from the cage and made him stand in the yard before the main house. Adjusted his chains so he could walk but not run. Stripped away his clothes, what remained after the voyage, leaving him naked in front of everyone. Whitmore circled him like a buyer at a horse auction. Pointing out his height, his muscles, the ritual scars on his chest marking him as his father's son. The crowd murmured and gasped. Some women covered their eyes. Some men cracked jokes that drew laughs. Through it all, Jabari stayed still. His face blank. His eyes, when they moved at all, moved slowly, taking in faces, positions, filing away information that might be useful later. Whitmore stopped in front of him and looked up. The colonel was tall for his generation, nearly 6 feet. But Jabari towered over him by more than half a foot. "Do you understand English?" Whitmore asked. Jabari said nothing. "Can you speak at all, or does your kind just grunt like the apes you are?" Jabari said nothing. Whitmore smiled. He'd expected this. Savages from the deep jungle wouldn't know civilized languages. That was part of the appeal. The utter foreignness of the creature. Its complete separation from the world of educated white men. "Take him to the quarters," Whitmore ordered. "Chain him in the large cabin. I want 4 men watching him at all times. If he tries anything, shoot him in the legs. I want him alive, but I don't need him mobile." The guards led Jabari away. The crowd scattered, chattering about what they'd seen, already spreading stories that would grow with each telling. The African giant had arrived. The entertainment was about to begin. What no one understood, what no one could have understood, was that the entertainment had already started. Just not the way they thought. Jabari was put in a cabin at the edge of the slave quarters. A structure that once housed a family of 6 now held only him and the guards assigned to watch him. 1 door, 2 windows, both barred. His ankle chain was attached to a ring bolted into the floor, giving him about 10 feet of movement in any direction. For the first week, he did nothing but watch. He watched the guards, learning their names, habits, weaknesses. 12 men assigned in rotating shifts of 4. Within days, he knew which ones drank on duty, which fell asleep, which were cruel for pleasure, which were just doing a job. He learned shift changes happened at 6 in the morning and 6 at night, and those 10 minutes during the change were the only times fewer than 4 guards were present. He watched the other workers through the cabin windows. Observing the rhythms of plantation life, movement of people and materials, locations of tools and supplies. He saw where the overseers stationed themselves during the day, and where they went at night. Which paths were busy, which were abandoned. He listened. The guards talked freely in front of him, assuming he couldn't understand. They complained about pay, treatment, their women. Gossiped about Whitmore and his plans, about other planters, about politics and money, all the small concerns filling their days. They talked about the workers, using words Jabari filed away, revealing personalities and relationships that might prove useful. Most importantly, they talked about the hunt. It was scheduled for August. Whitmore had sent invitations to a dozen friends, wealthy planters and former Confederate officers sharing his views and appetites. The African giant would be released into the swamp north of the plantation, given an hour head start, then pursued by men on horseback with dogs and rifles. The first to bring down the prey would win $500. The body would be displayed in New Orleans as proof of the savage nature of the African race. Jabari listened with no visible reaction. The guards read his silence as incomprehension. They were wrong. During those early weeks, something else happened that would change everything. Jabari met the other workers. They came to his cabin in small groups, brought by guards who wanted to show off the African giant, or who simply wanted to see how the enslaved people reacted to this creature from across the ocean. The workers looked at Jabari with expressions ranging from fear to curiosity to something that might have been hope. One worker was different. His name was Solomon, and he was 63. Born on Belmont when it still had its original French name. Raised under Whitmore's father. Survivor of 6 decades of slavery. Solomon had seen it all. Families torn apart. Children sold away from mothers. Men beaten to death for small offenses. He'd outlived 2 wives and 4 children, the wives dead from exhaustion and disease, the children sold to distant plantations from which no word ever came. Solomon should have been broken. By any reasonable measure, he should have been hollowed out. Reduced to the shuffling compliance the system was designed to create. He wasn't. Something in Solomon had survived. Call it faith. Call it stubbornness. Call it the simple human refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Whatever it was, it burned in his eyes. The same quality the overseers had seen in Jabari's eyes. The quality that marked someone as dangerous. Solomon came to Jabari's cabin on the 3rd night, after the guards had fallen into their usual patterns of inattention. He stood outside the window, invisible in the darkness, and spoke softly through the bars. "You understand, don't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. Jabari turned to look at him. For a long moment, neither spoke. I've seen that look before, Solomon continued. In men planning something. In men who weren't going to accept what was happening to them. He paused. Those men are all dead now. The ones who tried to fight. The ones who tried to run. Whitmore killed them all. Jabari still said nothing. But you're different, Solomon said. I can feel it. You're not scared. You're not even angry. Not really. You're thinking. Planning. Waiting. He moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping even lower. Whatever you're planning, I want to help. We all do. Everyone here. We've been waiting for something, someone, for years. Maybe you're what we've been waiting for. Jabari looked at the old man for a long time. Then, for the first time since his arrival at Belmont, he spoke. Tell me everything, he said. His English was heavily accented, but clear. He had been listening. Learning. Absorbing the language through weeks of immersion, the same way he'd absorbed Portuguese and Spanish on the ship. His mind, trained for tracking and analysis, had mapped the grammar and vocabulary of English onto the framework of his native tongue, creating a functional, if imperfect, translation. Solomon stared at him, momentarily shocked. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile he'd allowed himself in years. I will, he said. I'll tell you everything. Over the following weeks, Solomon became Jabari's main source of intelligence about Belmont. The old man visited the cabin regularly, always at night, always when the guards were distracted or asleep, and told Jabari everything he knew. He told him about the layout of the plantation. The 12,000 acres stretching from bayou to swamp. The fields, forests, and waterways crisscrossing the property. The main house, where Whitmore lived with his wife and 2 sons. The overseer's quarters. The stables, the kennels, the armory where weapons were stored. He told him about the people. The 217 workers held at Belmont against their will. Their names, ages, skills, relationships. Which ones could be trusted absolutely, and which might break under pressure. The natural leaders who had emerged despite the system's attempts to crush all leadership, men and women who kept hope alive through whispered conversations and small acts of resistance. He told him about Whitmore. The colonel's habits, schedule, weaknesses. His addiction to laudanum, taken every night to sleep. His temper, flaring unpredictably, leading to beatings that left workers crippled or dead. His arrogance, convincing him he was smarter than everyone else, that he'd thought of everything, that no one could possibly outmaneuver him. And he told him about the swamp. The swamp was key. Whitmore planned to release Jabari into the swamp for the hunt, confident an African jungle dweller would be helpless in unfamiliar terrain. Easy prey for men who knew the land. Whitmore was wrong. Solomon described the swamp in detail, having worked there as a young man cutting cypress for lumber. He drew maps in the dirt outside Jabari's window, showing channels and islands, high ground and quicksand, places where a man could hide and places where a man would die. He explained which plants were edible and which were poison, which animals were dangerous and which merely frightening, how to navigate by the stars when water and trees made ordinary landmarks useless. Jabari absorbed it all. The swamp is not so different from the jungle, he told Solomon one night. Water and trees and predators. I have lived in such places all my life. Whitmore thinks he is sending me into a trap. He is sending me home. Solomon nodded slowly. Then you have a chance. But a chance ain't enough. There's 12 men with guns and dogs. You'll be unarmed. Even if you know the land, they'll run you down eventually. Perhaps, Jabari said. If I am the prey. But what if I am the hunter? Solomon looked at him, not understanding. I have killed leopards, Jabari continued. Lions. Animals that are faster and stronger than any man. Do you know how I did it? Solomon shook his head. I did not chase them. I did not fight them on their terms. I studied them. I learned their patterns. I found their weaknesses. And then I created situations where their strengths became weaknesses. Where their confidence became a trap. He smiled, the first smile anyone at Belmont had seen from him. These men who will hunt me. They are confident. They believe they are the predators and I am the prey. That belief is their weakness. I will use it against them. How? Jabari told him. The plan took shape over months of whispered conversations and careful preparation. It was complex, requiring coordination among dozens of people taught their whole lives that resistance was futile, cooperation was death. It required acquiring closely guarded supplies, creating hiding places that wouldn't be discovered, developing signals and codes usable without alerting overseers. It also required Jabari to do something that went against every instinct he had developed as a hunter. He had to be patient. The hunt was scheduled for August. It was now March. 5 months of waiting. Of enduring daily humiliations. Of maintaining the fiction of incomprehension and docility while Whitmore and his men congratulated themselves on capturing such a magnificent specimen of African savagery. Jabari waited. He waited while Whitmore brought visitors to gawk at him, rich men and their wives who poked him with canes and made comments about his anatomy they'd never make about a white man. He waited while the guards amused themselves by throwing food at him like he was an animal in a zoo, laughing when he ate from the floor because they'd taken away his hands' freedom. He waited while Whitmore himself came night after night to sit in a chair outside the cabin and talk about the hunt, describing in detail what would happen, how Jabari would be chased through the swamp, how he'd be shot and skinned and displayed as a trophy. Through it all, Jabari showed nothing. His face remained blank. His eyes revealed nothing except the careful observation his captors mistook for animal vacancy. He played the role they expected. The savage beast too stupid to understand his fate, too broken to resist it. But inside, he was counting the days. And he was preparing. Solomon wasn't the only ally Jabari cultivated during those months. There was a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house, access to the family's schedule, keys, and weapons. There was a man named Isaiah who worked in the stables, knew the horses and dogs, could predict their behavior under different conditions. There was a teenager named Daniel who ran messages between fields and house, could move around without attracting suspicion. Each recruited carefully. Tested for reliability. Brought into the plan only when Jabari was certain they could be trusted. Each had their own reasons for wanting to fight back. Their own histories of loss and suffering. Their own burning desire to see Whitmore pay. Jabari didn't promise them revenge. He promised something more valuable, freedom. The plan wasn't just about surviving the hunt. It wasn't just about killing the men who came to kill him. It was about liberation. Breaking the chains holding 217 people in bondage. Creating an opportunity for escape that would never come again. The hunt would draw Whitmore and his friends away from the plantation. Focus their attention on the swamp, on the chase, the sport they'd come to enjoy. While they were distracted, deep in the wilderness pursuing what they thought was prey, the workers would act. Seize the armory. Neutralize the remaining guards. Gather supplies and animals and everything needed to survive a long journey. Then they would leave. Heading north toward Kansas. Toward territory where slavery had never taken root, where a community of freed people was building new lives. It was a desperate plan. It required everything to go right and nothing to go wrong. It required ordinary people to become soldiers overnight, to risk their lives on the slim chance that a giant African stranger could defeat a dozen armed men in an unfamiliar swamp. But it was also the only plan they had. And when Solomon presented it to the others, one by one, in whispered meetings held in the dead of night, not a single person refused. They were ready to fight. They had been ready for years. They just needed someone to show them how. The months passed slowly. Jabari used the time to train. He couldn't exercise openly, not with guards watching, but he found ways to maintain strength and conditioning within the constraints of his chains. He developed a routine of isometric exercises, tensing and releasing muscles against the resistance of his own body, building power invisible to observers. He practiced moving silently within his 10-foot radius, learning to control breath and footsteps until he could cross the cabin floor without a sound. He also trained his mind. Every night after the guards settled into their evening routine, Jabari closed his eyes and walked through the swamp in his imagination. Using Solomon's descriptions and the maps drawn in the dirt, he created a mental picture so vivid he could navigate without sight. He visualized the hunt, different scenarios, different positions, different responses. He planned for contingencies, for things going wrong, for situations requiring improvisation. He remembered his father's teachings. A hunter does not just kill. A hunter understands. He understands the land and the prey and himself. He understands that patience is more valuable than speed. That intelligence is more valuable than strength. That victory goes not to the fastest or strongest, but to the one who thinks most clearly when everything is chaos. Jabari understood. He also understood something else. Something his captors would never have believed possible. He was not alone. Word of the African giant spread through the network of enslaved people connecting plantations across Louisiana. Messages passed from worker to worker, plantation to plantation. An underground telegraph of whispers and coded songs and scraps of paper hidden in clothing. People Jabari would never meet knew about him. Knew about the hunt. Knew that something was being planned. And they were helping. Small things mostly. A guard at a neighboring plantation mentioning to his enslaved valet that Whitmore's dogs were trained to follow blood. A house servant in New Orleans overhearing her master discuss the hunt and passing along details about who would attend, what weapons they'd bring. A boatman on the bayou providing information about water levels and current patterns affecting movement through the swamp. Each piece found its way to Solomon, who found his way to Jabari's window in the darkness. By August, Jabari knew more about the hunt than many of the participants did. He knew the names of the 12 men who would pursue him. Their reputations, skills, weaknesses. Which were experienced hunters and which were wealthy dilettantes seeking a thrill. Which were dangerous and which were merely cruel. He knew Whitmore had purchased special ammunition for the occasion, bullets designed to wound rather than kill, to bring down the prey without destroying it completely. The colonel wanted his trophy alive if possible. Wanted the chance to deliver the final blow himself, in front of witnesses who would spread the story across the South. He knew the dogs, a pack of 6 mastiffs bred for tracking escaped slaves, would be released 30 minutes after Jabari entered the swamp, giving the prey a chance to create distance before the real pursuit began. He knew the men would follow on horseback until the terrain became impassable, then continue on foot, spreading out in a line to cover more ground. He knew no one expected him to survive the first hour. They were wrong. The morning of August 14th dawned hot and humid. Air so thick with moisture, breathing felt like drowning. Jabari had been awake since before dawn, running through the plan in his mind one final time. Checking each element against the preparations made over the previous months. At 7, guards came to his cabin and removed his chains. Replaced them with lighter restraints, a single rope around his wrists that could be cut quickly when the hunt began. They gave him clothes, rough cotton pants and a shirt, the first real clothing he'd worn since arriving at Belmont. They gave him a water bottle and a knife. The knife was a surprise. Whitmore had decided that sporting spirit required giving the prey some chance of defense, however minimal. The blade was dull. The handle loose. Nearly useless for combat. But Jabari accepted it without comment. He had no intention of using it for fighting. He had other plans. They led him out of the cabin and across the plantation to the northern boundary, where cultivated land ended and the swamp began. A crowd gathered to see him off, workers forced to witness the spectacle, white visitors eager for entertainment. Whitmore stood at the front, dressed in hunting clothes, a rifle over his shoulder, a smile on his face. "Today, gentlemen, we hunt the most dangerous game," he announced. An African savage, fresh from the jungles of the Congo. Armed only with his primitive instincts against the superior skills of civilized men. He paused for effect. "I give him 1 hour before the dogs find him. 2 hours before he's brought down. Who wants to take that bet?" Laughter from the crowd. Money changed hands as men wagered on how long the hunt would last. Whitmore turned to Jabari. "Do you have anything to say, savage? Any last words before you run for your pathetic life?" Jabari looked at him. For the first time since his arrival at Belmont, he let something show in his eyes. Not fear. Not anger. Something else. Contempt. "I will see you soon," he said. The words were clear. The English precise. Whitmore's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "So the beast can speak after all," he said. "How delightful. It will make the trophy even more valuable when we mount your head on my wall." He gestured to the guards. "Release him. Let the hunt begin." The rope around Jabari's wrists was cut. The crowd parted, creating a path toward the swamp. Jabari walked forward slowly, deliberately, refusing to run like the frightened prey they expected. At the edge of the trees, he stopped and turned back. Every eye was on him. The workers. The visitors. The guards. Whitmore himself. All watching. Waiting. Expecting him to flee into the darkness of the swamp. Jabari raised one hand and pointed directly at Whitmore. Then he vanished into the trees. The swamp swallowed him whole. The moment Jabari crossed into the swamp, he changed. On the plantation, he'd been a captive. A specimen. A creature on display for the amusement of cruel men. He had shuffled and stared and played the role they expected, the savage too stupid to understand his fate. He'd endured their mockery and violence and casual dehumanization without reaction, without resistance, without revealing anything beneath the surface. Now he was home. Not Louisiana. Not this specific swamp. But the world of water and trees and shadow that he'd known since childhood. The principles were the same in the Congo jungle and the Louisiana bayou. Move quietly. Stay hidden. Use the terrain. Think like the prey to anticipate the predator. Think like the predator to become something worse. Jabari moved through the swamp with speed and silence that would have astonished anyone watching. His bare feet found solid ground where others would have sunk into mud. His body slipped through gaps in vegetation that seemed too narrow for a man his size. Within 10 minutes, he'd covered half a mile. Within 20, he'd reached the first position Solomon had described, a small island of high ground surrounded by water too deep for horses and too murky for dogs to track through. He stopped there and began to prepare. The knife Whitmore had given him was nearly useless as a weapon, but Jabari had not planned to use it that way. He used it now to cut strips from his shirt, creating cordage he wove into simple snares. He used it to sharpen sticks into points, creating stakes he concealed in the mud along the approaches to the island. He used it to harvest vines he would later use for other purposes. While he worked, he listened. The swamp was alive with sound. Birds calling. Insects buzzing. Frogs croaking. The constant drip and splash of water moving through the maze of channels. But beneath those natural sounds, Jabari could hear others. The distant barking of dogs. The shouts of men. The noise of a hunting party that believed itself invincible, that made no effort at stealth because it never occurred to them that stealth might be necessary. They were coming. 30 minutes had passed since his release. The dogs would be in the swamp now, searching for his scent, leading the hunters toward their prey. Jabari smiled. He'd left a scent trail, of course. A clear path from the edge of the swamp to a point about a quarter-mile in, where the ground became unstable and the water grew deep. Anyone following the trail would find themselves in a maze of channels leading nowhere, burning time and energy while Jabari circled around behind them. But that was only the first layer of the plan. The real preparation had happened months ago, in whispered conversations through cabin windows, in supplies hidden throughout the swamp, in knowledge accumulated from Solomon and Isaiah and dozens of others who had contributed what they knew. Jabari was not just surviving. He was hunting. The first man died at 11:43 in the morning. His name was Robert Callahan. 41 years old. A plantation owner from Ascension Parish who came to the hunt because he was bored with his life and eager for excitement. He'd been a Confederate cavalry officer during the war, a position convincing him of his own martial prowess, despite never actually killing anyone in combat. He rode a fine horse. Carried an expensive rifle. Wore clothing specially tailored for the occasion. He also had a habit of riding ahead of the group, eager to be first to spot the prey, imagining the glory of bringing down the African giant. This habit killed him. Jabari had positioned himself in a cypress tree overlooking one of the main channels, invisible among the Spanish moss draping the branches. He watched the hunting party enter the swamp. Observed their formation. Noted which riders stayed close together and which ventured out alone. Callahan was the obvious choice. When the men rode beneath the tree, Jabari dropped. It wasn't a long fall, perhaps 12 feet, but Jabari used every inch. He landed on Callahan's back with his full weight, driving men from saddle into shallow water below. The impact stunned Callahan, knocked the breath from his lungs, gave Jabari the fraction of a second he needed. One hand clamped over Callahan's mouth. The other found the knife at the man's belt, a proper hunting knife with sharp blade and solid handle. The knife opened Callahan's throat before he could make a sound. The horse, panicked by sudden violence, bolted down the channel. The noise of its flight would draw attention, but by then Jabari would be gone, carrying Callahan's rifle, ammunition, knife, and water canteen. He left the body floating in the channel, face down. A message to whoever found it. The prey had teeth. The second man died at 1:15 in the afternoon. His name was James Thornton. 37. A lawyer from Baton Rouge with no business being on any kind of hunt. Overweight, out of shape, terrified of the swamp. Present only because his father-in-law, one of Whitmore's closest friends, insisted he come to prove his manhood. Thornton became separated from the group when his horse refused to cross a particularly deep channel. While he struggled with the animal, shouting for help that didn't come, Jabari emerged from the water behind him like a creature from nightmare. Thornton never saw what killed him. He felt a hand close around his ankle. Felt himself pulled from the saddle. Felt water close over his head. He struggled briefly before unconsciousness took him. He never woke up. Jabari held him under until the bubbles stopped, then released the body to float downstream. He took the man's pistol, a Colt Navy revolver with 6 rounds in the cylinder, and disappeared back into the water. The hunting party found Thornton's body 40 minutes later, tangled in roots at the edge of a channel. The discovery changed the mood of the hunt entirely. This was no longer sport. This was war. Whitmore gathered his remaining men on a patch of high ground and assessed the situation. 2 dead. Both killed silently and efficiently. Their weapons taken. The dogs were confused, circling, unable to hold scent in the watery terrain. The horses were nervous, sensing fear in their riders, becoming difficult to control. Some hunters wanted to leave. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. A chase through the swamp. A ceremonial kill. A trophy to brag about. Not this. Not actual danger. Not the possibility they might be the ones ending up dead. Whitmore refused. "He's one man," the colonel said, his voice tight with fury. "One savage with stolen weapons. We are 12 trained men with superior firepower. We do not run from animals. We hunt them down and kill them. He's killed 2 of us already," someone pointed out. "Through trickery. Through ambush. Through the kind of primitive cunning any wild beast possesses." Whitmore's eyes scanned the swamp, looking for movement, looking for anything. "He cannot face us directly. He knows he would lose. So we force him to face us. We spread out. We close in from all sides. We give him no room to maneuver. And when we corner him, we put him down like the dog he is." The plan was sound from a military perspective, against a conventional enemy. It might have worked. But Whitmore was not fighting a conventional enemy. He was fighting a man who had killed lions by understanding how they thought. Who had survived capture by understanding how his captors thought. Who understood the minds of men far better than they understood his. The hunters spread out as ordered, forming a loose circle contracting toward the center of the swamp. They moved slowly, carefully, watching for signs of ambush, calling out to maintain contact. The dogs ranged ahead, still searching for scent, still confused by the water and mud. Jabari watched them from a hidden position 300 yards away. He had anticipated this response. He had planned for it. And he knew exactly what to do. The third man died at 3:47 in the afternoon. His name was William Prescott, and he was the most dangerous of the hunters. A former Confederate sharpshooter who had killed more than 30 Union soldiers during the war. Prescott was calm, experienced, genuinely skilled with his rifle. If anyone in the group could spot Jabari before Jabari spotted him, it was Prescott. So Jabari killed him first. He did it from distance, using Callahan's rifle, firing from a concealed position across a channel too wide for accurate return fire. The bullet took Prescott in the chest, dropping him instantly. By the time the other hunters reached his position, Jabari was a quarter-mile away, moving through channels too shallow for pursuit. 3 dead. 3 hours. The arithmetic was becoming impossible to ignore. At 4:30, 2 of the remaining hunters announced they were leaving. They'd come for entertainment, not suicide. They'd take their chances with the swamp rather than continue a hunt that had become a slaughter. Whitmore let them go. He couldn't force them to stay, and their fear was becoming contagious, spreading to others, undermining the confidence he needed to maintain. Better to let the cowards leave than have them panic at a critical moment. 7 hunters remained. Whitmore, his 2 sons, and 4 others too proud or too stupid to quit. The sun was beginning to set. In an hour, the swamp would be dark. And in darkness, every advantage would shift to the prey. The hunters had lanterns, but lanterns created light visible from a distance. Light that would reveal their positions while hiding their quarry. Whitmore made a decision. "We camp here tonight," he announced. "Build fires. Establish a perimeter. 2 men on watch at all times. In the morning, we resume the hunt with fresh eyes and clear heads." It was a reasonable decision. It was also exactly what Jabari expected. The hunters made camp on a small island, the largest patch of dry ground in their immediate area. They built fires to keep away mosquitoes and night creatures. They posted sentries at opposite ends of the island. They ate cold rations and drank from their canteens and tried not to think about the 3 bodies floating somewhere in the darkness. Jabari watched them from a position in the trees 60 yards away, invisible in the darkness that was his natural element. He had eaten food from one of the supply caches Solomon had established months ago. He had rested briefly in a hidden shelter no one would ever find. He was ready for what came next. But first, he had other business to attend to. At 11 that night, while the hunters huddled around their fires and jumped at every sound, a different kind of action was taking place at Belmont. Solomon had been waiting for this moment for months. He had rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times, gone over every detail with the others, prepared for contingencies and disasters and everything that could possibly go wrong. When the signal came, a lantern flashed 3 times from the tree line. He moved. The armory was guarded by 2 overseers left behind when Whitmore took the primary security force to the hunt. They were playing cards, drinking whiskey, confident the workers would never dare to resist. They had beaten resistance out of these people years ago. They had nothing to fear from a bunch of broken slaves. Solomon approached them openly, shuffling, head down, the posture of submission they expected. Told them he had a message from the main house. Something about the hunt. Something urgent. The guards looked at each other, annoyed at the interruption, but let him approach. He was within arm's reach when Isaiah came through the back door. Isaiah was 43. Worked in the stables since he was 12. Knew every horse on the plantation, how to calm them, how to excite them, how to move among large, dangerous animals without being hurt. He also knew how to move silently. And he carried a hammer taken from the blacksmith's shed. The first guard died before he knew he was in danger. The second managed to shout once before Solomon's hands closed around his throat. The shout brought others running, workers who had been waiting in the shadows, who swarmed the armory and secured the weapons inside. Within 15 minutes, the remaining guards at Belmont had been neutralized. Some were killed. Others locked in the very cabins that had held enslaved people for generations. None escaped to warn Whitmore. Ruth, who had worked in the main house for 20 years, led a group to secure Whitmore's wife and sons. The wife, a frail woman named Elizabeth who had never shown kindness to the workers, fainted when she saw armed black men in her bedroom. The sons, teenagers who had inherited their father's arrogance but not his physical courage, surrendered without resistance. By midnight, Belmont was in the hands of its workers. Solomon gathered everyone in the yard in front of the main house. 217 people who had lived their entire lives under the control of the Whitmore family. He looked at their faces, saw fear and hope and disbelief mixing together, and told them what came next. "We're leaving," he said. "All of us. Tonight. We're heading north to Kansas, where free people have built communities that welcome folks like us." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's a long journey. 500 miles, maybe more. There'll be danger every step of the way. But I'd rather die free on that road than live another day under any white man's boot." He asked if anyone wanted to stay. No one did. They took everything they could carry. Food from storehouses. Clothing from the main house. Weapons from the armory. Horses and mules from the stables. They loaded wagons with supplies that would sustain them for weeks. They gathered children too young to understand what was happening and elders too old to travel fast but who would not be left behind. At 2 in the morning, the exodus began. They headed northwest, following routes Solomon had identified months ago, paths avoiding main roads and white settlements, trails through forests and along rivers that would hide their passage. They moved as quickly as they could with wagons and animals and people of all ages. Knowing every hour of head start was precious. Knowing pursuit would come eventually. Behind them, Belmont burned. Ruth had suggested it, and Solomon agreed. The main house. The overseer's quarters. The gin and the presses. Everything that represented Whitmore's power and wealth. Let it burn. Let him return to ashes. Let him know his world was gone, destroyed by the people he'd called animals. The flames rose into the night sky, visible for miles. A beacon announcing that something had changed. Something that could never be unchanged. In the swamp, Jabari saw the glow on the horizon. He smiled. Phase 1 was complete. Now came Phase 2. The hunters woke to the smell of smoke. At first, they thought it was their own fires dying down in the pre-dawn darkness. Then someone looked south and saw the orange glow. Panic spread through the camp like fever. "That's Belmont," Whitmore said, his voice hollow. "That's my home." He wanted to leave immediately. Rush back to the plantation. Save whatever could be saved. But the swamp was between him and home, miles of treacherous terrain that had already killed 3 of his men. And somewhere in that terrain, the African giant was waiting. They argued. Some wanted to go back. Some wanted to continue the hunt, kill the savage who'd caused all this, have at least that victory to show for the disaster. Some wanted to split up, half back, half staying. In the end, they did the worst possible thing. They hesitated. While they argued, debated, tried to decide what to do, Jabari moved. He had positioned himself during the night, circling around to the south side of their camp, placing himself between the hunters and their path home. He had prepared the ground, creating obstacles to slow pursuit, establishing fallback positions in case things went wrong. He was ready. The 4th man died at 6:12 in the morning, just as the sun began showing through the cypress trees. His name was Thomas Whitmore, the colonel's eldest son. 23 years old. The heir to everything his father had built. He died trying to prove himself. Trying to spot the enemy that had killed his friends. Trying to be the hero his father had always wanted. Jabari shot him from 40 yards. A clean shot through the heart. Thomas fell into the water and did not rise. The colonel screamed. It was a sound Jabari would remember for the rest of his life. A sound of pure anguish, a father watching his son die. For a moment, just a moment, Jabari felt something that might have been pity. Whitmore was a monster. But monsters could love their children. Could feel pain when those children were taken. Then Jabari remembered Amara. His own sister, threatened with a knife because of men like Whitmore. Men who saw other human beings as animals to be used and discarded. He remembered the ship. The darkness. The sound of people dying in chains. He remembered every humiliation he'd endured at Belmont. Every cruelty inflicted on the workers he'd come to know. The pity died. "Colonel." Jabari's voice echoed through the swamp, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Your son is dead. Your home is burning. Your slaves are free." He paused, letting each word strike like a blow. "Come and face me. Men to men. Hunter to hunter. Or run home and find ashes." Whitmore's response was incoherent, a stream of curses and threats meaning nothing. But Jabari could see him moving. Pushing through water toward the source of the voice, rifle raised, eyes wild with grief and rage. The other hunters tried to follow, but Jabari had planned for this. The obstacles he'd created, fallen trees, hidden channels, separated Whitmore from his men, channeled him toward a specific location. A clearing on a small island. Where Jabari waited. They faced each other across 20 feet of muddy ground. Whitmore looked like a man who'd lost everything. Clothes torn and filthy. Face scratched from branches pushed through blindly. Eyes red from grief and sleeplessness, fixed on Jabari with hatred so intense it seemed to distort the air between them. Jabari looked like what he was. A hunter. A warrior. A man who had come through fire and emerged stronger. "You think you've won," Whitmore said. His voice steady now. Cold. The voice of a man who had accepted death and no longer feared it. "You've killed my son. You've burned my home. You think that makes you the victor?" "No," Jabari said. "I think it makes us even." "Even?" Whitmore laughed, a sound without humor. "You think the life of my son equals the lives of animals? You think your pathetic revenge balances any scale? I think," Jabari said slowly, "that you are going to die in this swamp. And I think that when you die, you will know that everything you believed was a lie. You are not superior. You are not civilized. You are a small man with a loud voice, and the world will forget you existed within a generation." Whitmore raised his rifle. Jabari was faster. He had dropped his own rifle minutes ago, knowing this confrontation would come, knowing he wanted to end it differently. He crossed the 20 feet between them before Whitmore could aim. Slammed into the colonel with his full weight. Drove him to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. They fought. Whitmore was not a weak man. Not old. Not inexperienced in violence. He'd killed men before, in war and in peace. And he fought now with the desperate strength of someone with nothing left to lose. But Jabari was stronger. Faster. Better trained. He had fought leopards and lions, creatures that could kill a man in seconds, and won. Whitmore, for all his cruelty, was just a man. The fight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, Whitmore lay on his back in the mud. Jabari's knee on his chest. Jabari's hands around his throat. The colonel's face turning purple. Eyes bulging. Hands clawing uselessly at Jabari's arms. Jabari leaned close. "I could kill you now," he said. "I should kill you. For your son's death. For the people you enslaved. For everything you have done." He squeezed tighter, watching Whitmore's eyes begin to glaze. "But death is too easy for you. Death is escape. I want you to live." He released his grip. Whitmore gasped. Coughed. Sucked air into his lungs. He tried to speak, but his throat was too damaged. "I want you to live," Jabari repeated. "So that you can see what comes next. Your slaves are gone. Your home is ashes. Your son is dead. Your wealth, your power, your precious white superiority, all of it is gone. And you will spend the rest of your miserable life knowing it was taken from you by the people you called animals." He stood up, looking down at the broken man in the mud. "That is my revenge." He left Whitmore there and walked away. The remaining hunters found their leader an hour later. Alive, but destroyed. His second son had survived the night, as had 4 other men. They carried Whitmore out of the swamp on a makeshift stretcher, a journey that took most of the day. When they reached Belmont, they found exactly what Jabari had promised. Ashes. The main house was gone, nothing but a blackened shell. The outbuildings were gone. The stables, the gin, the presses, all gone. The cabins where the workers had lived still stood, empty now. Monuments to the system that had died along with everything else. No workers. No horses. No supplies. Nothing but destruction and absence. A void where Whitmore's empire had been. The colonel was taken to a hospital in New Orleans, where doctors treated his injuries and tried to understand the babbling story he told about an African giant who commanded wolves and spirits and had destroyed everything with supernatural power. They assumed he'd gone mad with grief. Perhaps he had. Meanwhile, Jabari had already rejoined the Exodus. He caught up with Solomon and the others on the second day of their journey, appearing suddenly from the forest like a ghost. The children screamed when they saw him. The adults reached for weapons before recognizing him. Solomon embraced him like a son. "It's done," Jabari said. "Whitmore lives, but he is broken. He will not follow." "And the others?" "4 dead. The rest fled." Jabari paused. "His son died, the older one. I killed him." Solomon nodded slowly. He offered no sympathy, no condemnation. He understood that war was war. That the death of an enemy's child was tragedy but not crime. That Jabari had done what was necessary to ensure everyone else could be free. Then we move, Solomon said. We have a long way to go. They moved. The journey to Kansas took 43 days. It was the hardest thing any of them had ever done. Harder than backbreaking labor in the fields. Harder than beatings and deprivation. Harder than anything they'd experienced in lives filled with hardship. They walked through forests and swamps. Across rivers and prairies. Through territory sometimes friendly, often hostile. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the day, avoiding roads and towns where white faces might mean capture or death. They lost people along the way. An old woman named Martha died on the 12th day, her heart giving out during a difficult river crossing. A young man named Peter was shot by a farmer who caught him stealing corn from a field. A child, a little girl no more than 3, developed a fever no medicine could cure. Each death was a wound. Each loss a reminder of what the journey cost. But they kept moving. Jabari became their protector, their scout, their hunter. He ranged ahead, identifying dangers, finding safe paths, killing game to supplement dwindling supplies. He taught the younger men what he knew about tracking and stalking and survival, knowledge passed down through generations of his family that would now take root in American soil. He also learned. He learned English properly, beyond the functional pidgin he'd developed at Belmont. He learned about America, its history, geography, and the impossible contradictions defining it. A nation built on freedom that had enslaved millions. A democracy that denied humanity to people based on skin color. He learned about the war that supposedly ended slavery. About Reconstruction that was supposed to rebuild the South. About the 1,000 ways white Americans found to maintain their power despite losing on the battlefield. And he learned about the people he traveled with. Their names and stories. Their hopes and fears. Their strengths and weaknesses. He learned that Solomon had once been a preacher, leading secret worship services in the quarters, keeping faith alive among people with every reason to despair. He learned that Ruth had been born free in Philadelphia, kidnapped and sold at 16, spent 20 years dreaming of escape. He learned that Isaiah's grandfather had been African, telling stories of the homeland that Isaiah memorized and now told others. A chain of memory connecting Louisiana to the Congo across 200 years of separation. They became his people. Not by blood, but by something stronger. Shared struggle. Mutual sacrifice. The simple fact that they had survived together what should have been unsurvivable. On the 43rd day, they crossed into Kansas. The town was called Nicodemus. Founded 2 years earlier by formerly enslaved people from Kentucky who'd heard that Kansas was a place where black people could own land and govern themselves. By 1869, it had a population of about 300, spread across several hundred acres of prairie they were slowly transforming into farms. The arrival of 217 refugees from Louisiana was overwhelming. The town didn't have enough housing, enough food, enough anything to accommodate such a sudden influx. But the people of Nicodemus did what they could. Shared what they had. Built shelters. Found ways to feed everyone until the newcomers could establish themselves. Jabari was offered a place in the community. He declined. "I cannot stay," he told Solomon on the night after their arrival. "This is your home now. But it is not mine. Where will you go?" Jabari looked west, toward the setting sun, toward the vast expanse of America he had only begun to understand. "I do not know. But I know that I am not finished. There are others like me. Others who were taken from Africa. Others still trapped in places like Belmont. If I can help them, I must." Solomon nodded. He had expected this. He had seen something in Jabari from the beginning, a restlessness that could not be contained by any single place, a purpose extending beyond personal survival. "Then go," Solomon said. "Do what you must. But know that you will always have a home here, whenever you want to return." Jabari left Nicodemus the next morning. He spent the next 23 years traveling across the American South and West. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with others who shared his purpose. He helped establish escape routes for people still trapped in conditions of slavery or near slavery. He fought against white supremacy wherever he found it, in battles sometimes physical, sometimes political, sometimes simply a matter of being present, of showing that black men could be strong and free and unbroken. He never returned to Africa. The journey was too long, the cost too high, and by the time it might have been possible, too many years had passed. His family, if any survived, would not know him. His village, if it still existed, would have changed beyond recognition. America became his home. Not by choice, but by circumstance. He married in 1878. A woman named Clara, who had escaped slavery in Georgia and worked as a teacher in a freedmen's school in Tennessee. They had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. He taught them everything he knew, the hunting skills of his ancestors, the survival techniques he developed, the lessons of courage and perseverance his life had taught him. He also told them stories. Stories of Africa, the land he remembered with increasing difficulty as years passed, but refused to forget. Stories of the ship, the darkness, the journey that brought him to this country. Stories of Belmont, of the hunt, of the night when everything changed. Stories of Solomon and Ruth and Isaiah, the people who trusted him with their lives and were not disappointed. And stories of his sister Amara, whom he'd saved through his own capture and whom he would never see again. Jabari died in 1892, at the age of 40. A fever swept through the small town in Oklahoma where he had finally settled. His death was noted in the local newspaper with a brief paragraph describing him as a farmer and community leader, mentioning nothing of what he'd done. But the people who knew him remembered. They remembered a man who stood over 6'7" and moved through the world with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. They remembered a man who faced impossible odds and won, not through strength alone, but through intelligence and patience and refusal to accept defeat. They remembered a man who taught them that the color of your skin does not determine your worth, that the circumstances of your birth do not define your destiny, that every human being has the capacity for courage if they choose to use it. Most of all, they remembered what he taught them about revenge. True revenge, Jabari had said, was not about killing your enemies. It was about outliving them. It was about building something they said could not be built. Becoming something they said you could not become. Proving through your existence that everything they believed was wrong. Colonel Marcus Whitmore died in 1874, 5 years after the hunt. He never recovered from that night in the swamp. Never rebuilt his plantation. Never regained his wealth or standing. He spent his final years in a New Orleans boarding house, drinking himself to death, telling anyone who would listen about the African giant who destroyed him. No one believed him. No one cared. He died alone, forgotten, a footnote in history already moving past him. Jabari died surrounded by family in a community he helped build, leaving behind children and grandchildren who would carry his legacy forward for generations. That was his revenge. In 1936, a researcher from the Federal Writers Project traveled to Oklahoma to interview elderly African Americans about their lives. Among the people she interviewed was a woman named Constance Walker, 91 years old, born in Kansas in 1845, spent most of her life in the West. Constance had a story she wanted to tell. She'd heard it from her husband, who'd heard it from his father, who'd been present at Nicodemus when the refugees from Louisiana arrived in 1869. The story was about a giant African man who killed slave hunters in the swamps of Louisiana. Who led 200 people to freedom across 500 miles of hostile territory. Who became a legend among black communities throughout the South and West. The researcher wrote down everything Constance told her. The transcript was filed with thousands of others, stored in archives that would not be fully examined for decades. In 1976, a historian named Robert Williams discovered the transcript while researching post-Civil War African American communities. He was intrigued by the story of the African giant, too dramatic to be true, but too detailed to be entirely invented. Williams spent 3 years following the trail. He found records of illegal slave ships arriving in Cuba in 1868, including manifests listing African captives by height and distinguishing features. He found newspaper accounts of a fire at a Louisiana plantation called Belmont in August 1869, described as accidental but never fully explained. He found census records showing a sudden increase in the black population of Nicodemus, Kansas in late 1869. He found death records for a man named Jabari Walker in Oklahoma in 1892, noting that the deceased was of unusual height and African birth. Piece by piece, he assembled the story. Williams published his findings in 1982, in a book called The Giant of Louisiana, a minor classic of African American history. The book brought Jabari's story to a wider audience, inspiring documentaries, novels, and eventually a movement to establish a memorial at the site of the former Belmont plantation. The memorial was dedicated in 2012, on land purchased by a coalition of civil rights organizations and African American historical societies. It stands today, a bronze statue of a man nearly 7 feet tall, his face turned toward the north, his arms outstretched as if welcoming everyone who approaches. At the base of the statue is a plaque with words Jabari reportedly spoke to his children, passed down through 4 generations of oral tradition. *, they called me an animal. They said I had no soul, no mind, no right to live as a man. They put me in chains and told me I was property. But chains cannot hold a spirit. Cages cannot contain a will. I am not what they called me. I am what I have always been. A hunter. A warrior. A free man. *. Beneath those words, a single line added by the Memorial Committee, *, the love of freedom lives in every human heart. *. Every year on August 14th, the anniversary of the hunt, people gather at the memorial to remember what happened there. They come from across the country. Descendants of the people Jabari saved. Descendants of slaves from other plantations. Descendants of free black people who never experienced bondage but understand its legacy. They come to honor a man who refused to be what the world told him he was. Who fought back against impossible odds. Who proved that resistance was possible. They come to remember. And somewhere in the swamp, in the channels and islands where the hunt took place over a century and a half ago, the cypress trees still stand. The water still flows. The birds still call. If you go there on a quiet night when the moon is full and the air is still, locals say you can sometimes hear something that sounds like footsteps in the water. Something that sounds like a man moving through the swamp, silent and swift, hunting or being hunted. It is impossible to tell. They say it is Jabari. Still watching. Still protecting. Still free. The story of Jabari teaches us something every generation needs to learn again. It teaches us that the people who oppress others always underestimate them. They see size, or strength, or color of skin, and think they know everything. They think they have measured the limits of what the oppressed can do, can be, can become. They are always wrong. Inside every person told they are worthless, there is a spark that refuses to die. Inside every person chained, there is a will that cannot be contained. Inside every person hunted, there is a hunter waiting to emerge. Jabari did not defeat Whitmore because he was bigger or stronger, though he was both. He defeated Whitmore because he was smarter, more patient, more determined. He defeated Whitmore because he understood something Whitmore never could: the person being hunted knows the stakes better than the hunter ever will. For the hunter, failure means disappointment. For the hunted, failure means death. That difference changes everything. It sharpens the mind. It focuses the will. It turns ordinary people into heroes and victims into victors. Jabari knew this. He had learned it in the jungles of the Congo, hunting animals that could kill him with a single blow. He applied it in the swamps of Louisiana, hunted by men who thought he was an animal. He was not an animal. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. The people of Belmont understood this too. Solomon and Ruth and Isaiah and all the others who risked their lives on a desperate plan. They were not warriors by training. They were not hunters by tradition. They were ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of what anyone should have to endure. But when the moment came, they were ready. They rose up. They seized their freedom. They walked 500 miles through hostile territory to build new lives in a place where they could be truly free. That is the lesson Jabari left us. That is the truth his story tells. Freedom is not given. It is taken. Freedom is not safe. It is dangerous. Freedom is not easy. It is the hardest thing there is. But freedom is worth it. Worth the risk. Worth the struggle. Worth everything you have to sacrifice to achieve it. Jabari knew this. He lived it. He died still believing it. And his descendants carry that belief forward, generation after generation, keeping his memory alive, telling his story to anyone who will listen. Because stories are how we remember. Stories are how we learn. Stories are how the courage of the past becomes the courage of the present and the future. This is Jabari's story. Remember it. And when you face your own impossible odds, when you find yourself hunted by forces too powerful to resist, remember the giant African who walked into a Louisiana swamp and came out the other side a legend. Remember that he was underestimated. Remember that he refused to be what they told him he was. Remember that he won. You can win too. That is the truth of the story. That is the truth of every story like it. The love of freedom lives in every human heart,